Okay. And 1 second while I try to figure out my screen here. All right. Got an agenda for today, and Larry and I will be going over the grant application requirements and then the additional scoring criteria. And as you can see here, next up we'll have our working lands category, where Jen Perkins and Amanda Sheps from Department of Forestry will be going over their two categories. Terry wasn't able to join us today, and luckily we have Amanda to step in for him. Thank you for joining us. And next, Wendy Musamechi from Department of Historic Resources will be covering the Historic Resources category. And Rob Evans from DCR's Division of Natural Heritage will cover the Natural Areas category. And then we'll finish going over the 5 categories with Crystal McKelvey from DCR, as well as Larry, me, and Nathan from DCR will probably cover up and that open space and parks category. And then we'll end with questions from the audience. If you have questions for each category as we go through, please feel free to type those in the chat. Gina is here with us in my backyard to help us monitor questions as they come up. And you can either, ask during each of the presentations or wait till the end, and we'll try to address those questions as they come up. And I'm going to try to advance my slides. Okay. We're just going to start out with a brief overview of the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation. From the slide, you can see it was created in '92, but wasn't funded until 2000. We've got a 19-member board that has representation from across the Commonwealth. The Secretary of Natural Resources and the Secretary of Agriculture and Agriculture and Forestry sit on the board. And we do have an interagency task force of agency subject matter experts, which is directed by the code to develop the scoring criteria for our grant manual. And they also assist us with scoring all of the projects and making recommendations to the board. And so far, VLCF has had 13 grant rounds, and we've awarded just about $50 million over those grant rounds. Here's a schedule that you guys will want to be sure to follow. The application deadline is November 30th, which is the Monday after Thanksgiving. And we'll need to receive those, get them time-stamped by 4 p.m. on the 30th at DCR's office. The address and everything is in the grant manual and the grant application. Throughout December, we will organize and share those applications with the subject matter experts by category. And then we'll get together 1 or 2 times as the task force to score the projects and make recommendations to the Secretary of Natural Resources and our Director of DCR. And then by mid-January, we hope to have the board get together to hear our recommendations and make the final grant awards. And now for this year's grant round, we have $3,375,000 in funding. The funds are to be equally divided among these 4 categories. And again, farmlands and forest land preservation share a category. And then the Code of Virginia and the budget set out certain requirements for the funding to make sure we have at least a third of the funds for easements held by a public body, and at least half of the funding has to go to public access projects. We strive to get a geographic distribution throughout the Commonwealth, and up to 50% of a project's cost can be funded by VLCF, except for a state agency, which can get 100% funding. Next slide. Okay, now for the grant manual.
Do you know where the bug is that goes with this?
On the shelf, honey. Sorry, I'm also, my son is in school, virtually learning, and has art class today. All right, now we're going to go over a little bit of our grant manual with you all. We've got a few provisions that are new and different this year from prior years. Larry was able to separate our application from the grant manual, and this was to sort of streamline the manual, and we hope that it does that. I don't know if it really worked out to be that way. They both seem pretty thick. But the manual does condense important information in Appendix A, so be sure to look that over. And instead of 3 paper copies, we only need 1 paper copy to be delivered in the application this year. And just make sure that the electronic file is, everything's in one file and in a searchable PDF format, please. And then we received a lot of feedback over the years about ALTA surveys being too burdensome. And we were able to work with our, the OAG and others so we don't have to require ALTA surveys anymore for fee simple acquisition projects, which is good news for everyone, I think. So also this grant round, we're acquiring some new property protections for all projects. And these resource protections are listed in Appendix D. So all projects now and their final deed of easement will need to require an agricultural conservation plan, a forest management plan, and pre-harvest plan. And there's new requirements for riparian buffers. As you can see here, we've listed out the 2 differences for mowing, amount of times the buffer could be mowed. And also there's no earth disturbing activities to occur in the buffer. And another requirement involves limitation on placement of utilities so that they do not interfere with the conservation values of the property. Here we just have some general program requirements as to who can apply. You can see governmental and nonprofit organizations that meet the holder requirements that are set out in the Conservation Easement Act. Projects have to be for a specific site, and the parcel has to be identified in the application. Projects should be able to be completed within 2 years, but we do have the flexibility to allow a 1-year extension for extenuating circumstances. Projects by nonprofits have to have an open space easement.
Paint? We need paint.
It's all in your box, honey. In your box or the school box. Excuse me. Public body has to hold an open space easement on the project. And then again, the 50% match is required as a minimum for all applicants except state agencies. This slide covers our scoring, which is done by, like I said earlier, our interagency task force of agency subject matter experts. And then we went over who's going to be presenting to you, and they will be the ones that help us score the applications. But we also have representatives from the Department of Wildlife Resources and Virginia Outdoors Foundation on our task force. So your grants applications will be scored as listed in the manual and the appendix. There's the 5 statutory categories, and each category totals up to 100 points. And we recommend that all applicants choose a secondary category, and be sure to include information in your application that addresses all of the criteria in that secondary category as well. Sorry. So in addition to the 100 points you can get in your category, all applications can get additional scoring under the additional scoring criteria, and that's up to 72 points. So we want to point out to everyone to be sure to address all those criteria as well to maximize the amount of points you get. Score your application, and then make sure all the points you give yourself are addressed in the application. Okay, and then this last bullet just states that everything you claim that you will do in your application for the project, all of the protections that are promised in the application that get points, you will be expected to follow through with those in the final deed of easement that's recorded on the property. So in the example here, say that you promise to have 100-foot riparian buffers on all perennial streams, and those buffers will be forested. Well, you're going to get more points for that, and we're going to look for that in that final deed of easement before we disperse the grant funds. Okay, now we're going to step through the additional scoring criteria, and on each of these slides we provide a link to the database or reference that we are referring to. So here we're talking about the first scoring criterion that's listed on page 21 involves the Virginia Outdoors Plan. Is your project providing a resource conservation need that's been identified in the VOP? Let's see, and so here you can see just the website about the VOP where you can access the VOP and read through it. It's all online. Second, will your project provide public access, and does it demonstrate a need for terrestrial or water-based access as based in the Virginia Recreation Access Model? On this page, we provided a picture for you of the Virginia's Natural Heritage Database Explorer. Got the address, the website address up there, and if you go into this map, you don't have to have a membership to get into this map. You'll see you can type the address of your project in the upper right-hand corner and then zoom into the site. And then you'll see in that red circle on the bottom left, you can check on the Recreation Access Model to score your project. And this Natural Heritage Database Explorer is used on many of these criteria. Including next, we have the water quality benefit. Again, you can zoom in on your project and you can switch the base map in that left-hand side and pick the topo maps. And there you'll see any solid blue line would designate a perennial stream or water body without perennial outflow. Number 4 is a new criterion that we felt was very important for projects that have cultural resources that haven't risen to the level of being protected or listed by the Department of Historic Resources. So we're looking for projects, or you would get points here if there's a local cultural resource on the property that will be protected by this project. We've listed some examples, and so it's up to the applicant to tell us about these resources, whether it's an archaeological resource or an old schoolhouse, provide photos and documentation, and tell us how you're going to protect that resource. So here we're looking for additional conserved Virginia values. You'll see when we go through each of the categories that conserved Virginia is referenced under each category. However, if your project falls in multiple layers of conserved Virginia, this is where you can tell us how you're going to protect those additional values. And here we just show you, I think others will go into this in more detail, but again, you go to Virginia Natural Heritage Database Explorer, you zoom in on your project, click Conserve Virginia, and then you click on each of the color-coded categories separately to see if they light up in your project. Next, we have our wildlife criteria. And here you can get up to 10 points depending on the different species of wildlife that you tell us about on your property in the project. Tell us how you're protecting the habitat and whether or not the public will have access to view, hunt, or fish the wildlife. And we've got Becky Gwynn's name and phone number here if you have any questions on this criterion. And then on the next slide, we'll show you this Virginia Fish and Wildlife Information Service. So we've got the link here. And then this is their website and their database where you can search for your property in the geographic search. Number 7 is public access. The more days your project is open to the public, the more points you'll get. And number 8 is a new criterion for underserved communities. Does your project benefit an underserved or socially vulnerable community? We chose to share the VIMS Social Vulnerability Index with you to use as a potential source to look up your property and see how it scores and share that score with us. But we are not wed to the VIMS model. We know there's other models out there, such as EPA's environmental justice model, and a couple other models have been shared with us as well. So once we get this posted, I will share the other links as well, or the other models that have been recommended to us on our website. So you'll have a couple to choose from. But this is the one that we recommend because we liked all the different attributes that they consider, and it's Virginia specific. And finally, we look to the amount of match that you're bringing forward in your application. We feel that the more match that's already secured, the more likely the project will close within 2 years. So more points are awarded for the more match that you bring with your application. Okay, and finally, here are our names. I guess I didn't start out by introducing myself. I'm Sue Bobolkaya, and then Larry Mickelson works with me and will be very reliably assisting in this grant process. All right.
We do have some questions.
Okay, we do have some questions. So why don't I mute myself and let Gina read the questions and I'll answer them.
All right. You might need to mute your or turn off your sound too.
Okay.
Sorry, this is a confusion of Sue and I sitting near each other. So we had a couple questions which Larry already chimed in and answered. Jim Lynch had asked if state agencies count, and Larry answered to confirm that counties and county agencies do count and can apply for this grant. Todd Fortune asked how to submit the electronic version, and Larry said that you can just mail that or drop that off with the paper copy as a CD or flash drive. Andrea Reese asked, can you speak to how the prohibition on earth disturbance activity within the buffer interacts or conflicts with the goal of providing public water access? Can an amenity such as a small boat launch be accommodated? Do you want to answer that, Sue?
Sure.
Or, okay.
I'll unmute myself.
I will then mute.
Okay. Andrew, I think there's allowances provided for in the appendix, but yes, we would allow for water access and crossings, as well as other reasonable requests. Those are all laid out in the one of the appendices. Were there other questions?
Yes. Jim Lynch asked if there can be a trail in the buffer.
Yes, Jim, there can be a trail, and as long as it's not paved within the buffer.
All right. Heather Groves asked, for Conserve Virginia layers, does the full parcel have to be included in the layer in order to get points? What if only a small portion is in the layer?
You'll notice in the criteria, especially if you look at the tables for each of the different categories, it's broken out to 1% to 49%, you get half the points. 50 to 100% in Conserve Virginia, you get full points.
All right. Todd Fortune was asking, is it a 50% or 60% match?
For extra. 50% is required, but if you do 60% or more, you get extra points. And those are laid out in the criteria under additional points.
All right, we've got a couple more questions here. Liz Belcher was wondering if VOF core grants can be used as a match.
Yes, any other funding source can be used as match, including via other state funding.
Also related to the match, Jim Lynch was wondering if it can be for the sale, can it be for a sale amount below the appraised value if it's a land acquisition?
I'm sorry, can it be for less than the appraised amount?
Yes, I guess that's the question.
Yes, we look at the appraised amount and your total costs for acquisition, and would provide 50% of that. So we wouldn't pay for more than the appraised value. I hope that answers your question. If not, let us know.
All right. John Harbin was wondering if match for VLCF comes, if it can come from someone besides the grant applicant. So Could a municipality cover that, or a different grant?
Yes, again, another state grant, a locality, a landowner donation all count as match.
Lots of questions regarding match. Wendy Austin was wondering if there's a limit on the amount of land value that can be used as a match, and how do you establish the value of land for that?
You would have to get an appraisal, and again, we would eligible costs are cost of the land, and then your due diligence to acquire the land. So that would include surveys and appraisals and closing costs. Those are all eligible expenses, and then the grant covers 50% of those costs.
This is Larry. I'd like to mention and
that
see.
wraps up the questions for the first section. We did get one comment asking if speakers could introduce themselves when they start presenting, because our names sometimes show up funny in the GoToMeeting boxes, or you might not be able to see it.
No, Okay, sorry about that. Took me a little while to figure out how to get to the next PowerPoint presentation. Next, we'll have Jen Perkins of Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services go over the farmlands category. Jen,
Yeah.
are you there?
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Can you all hear me?
Jen.
Can you hear
Jen,
me?
I think we can hear you. Yes,
Oh, okay.
Jen, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. All right, yes. So as Sue said, my name is Jen Perkins, and I'm in the Office of Farmland Preservation at VDAX. And
I see she's here, but sorry.
That's okay. Okay.
Muted my computer so to avoid the echo. I forgot to put it back on.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm in the Office of Farmland Preservation at VDAX, and I'm going to be talking about the farmland scoring, but wanted to just give a quick note on the farmland and forest preservation category before I start, because we're a little bit different. So this is a single funding category, as Sue had mentioned, unless there's more than $10 million available, which obviously isn't the case this year. So our pool of money is divided typically equally between the farm and forest projects, and they have separate funding criteria. So just make sure you use the set of criteria that works best and is most appropriate for your project. So next slide, please. I think you can just skip that one.
There you go.
So for farmland, there are a total of 100 points, and they are broken into 3 different categories. The first is land evaluation, which has 40 points, then land use, which also has 40 points, and then finally the Conserve Virginia, which is 20 points. Next slide, please. So category 1 has two different scoring criteria. The first of which is a maximum of 25 points, which is dealing with soil quality. And we're really looking for soils that support agriculture. And there's a formula that you can see on the scoring criteria that's based on the percentage of prime, unique, or important soils. So next. So to figure out how much of your property meets these criteria, you can go online to the NRCS Web Soil Survey. The site is listed on this slide, but you can also just Google Web Soil Survey and it will be the first thing that comes up. And what we are asking you to do is to calculate the percentage of soils that are prime, which are soils that are that possess desirable characteristics for ag and forestry production, unique, which are non-prime soils that are being used to produce high quality or high yield crops, or important, which are soils that are identified as critical for agricultural production at the state or local level. And it's really important to note, especially since this is the largest point category, that if you don't put the percentages in your application, the assumption will be that you do not have any of these soils and you'll get 0 points for the category. All right, next. All right, so the second scoring criteria in category 1 is the average size of the farm, which can get a maximum of 15 points. And this criteria looks at the average farm size for the locality where the project is located, and then points are awarded based on the project size relative to that average farm size. And so basically, the larger a property is relative to that average, the higher the points. So for instance, on this slide, you can see in the third column over that the average farm size in Accomack is 321 acres. So if the applicant property in this case were 25% larger than 321 acres, or give or take 402 acres, it would get the maximum amount of points. And then between 321 acres and 402, it would get 10 points. And then if it were smaller than the average size, the points decrease with 7 points for a property that is up to 24% smaller, and then 5 points for anything that is 25% or more smaller than the size, which is a little confusing to say out loud, but should be relatively clear on the scoring criteria. So you can get this information on the US Census of Agriculture. And again, the site is listed here, but I find this website to be a little bit tricky to navigate sometimes and can't always locate the table that I'm after. So feel free to email me if you're having trouble finding that information. All right, next. All right, so the second category is land use. And there are, as I mentioned, 40 available points that are broken out into 4 different categories. The first of these is pretty straightforward. It's the current and historical use of the property. So you get 4 points if the land is currently being farmed and in agricultural production, and 4 points if the property is a designated century farm. Most landowners will know if their property is a century farm, but if you need to look it up, you can find all of the century farm designations on our website. They're broken down by county. But again, if you have trouble finding it, or if it's listed in an older iteration of ownership, just let me know and I can look it up in the database as well. All right, next. Okay, so next we have proximity to other preserved lands for a maximum of 10 points. And this information you can find on the Natural Heritage Data Explorer, which Sue talked about earlier. And basically, it's the closer you are to other conserved land, the higher the points. And I did want to point out that in this instance, other conserved lands can include all types of conservation. So it doesn't have to be a farmland preservation, conservation. It could be forestry, historic preservation, basically anything goes. All right, next. So the third criteria is threat of development, and there's a maximum of 8 points for this. The Conservation Vision Development Vulnerability Model, which is also in the Natural Heritage Data Explorer ranks the threat of development to land and divides that up into classes, class 1 being no threat, to class 5 being the most highly threatened. And the points are awarded based on threat of development. So a class 5 threat would get the full 8 points, and then it goes down by 2 points each to the class 2. All right, next. All right, so the fourth criteria is the implementation of best management practices, or BMPs, for a maximum of 10 points. We award points for both voluntary BMPs as well as those that are implemented through a conservation program. And then we apply additional points if there is a formal conservation plan or a nutrient management plan that has been put together by one of the state or federal agencies. All right, next. And then finally, there are 4 points available for local policies that support agricultural land use in the locality where the applicant is located. And 1 point each is available for demonstrated support for farmland preservation through inclusion in the comprehensive plan, if the locality has agricultural zoning, if they participate in the ag and forestal district programming, or if they have adopted use value taxation. So you could get anywhere from 1 to 4 points. All right, next, please. And then finally, the final category is a maximum of 20 points for being in the Conserve Virginia agricultural layer. And as Sue mentioned, you basically can go to the Natural Heritage Data Explorer and then highlight the ag and forestry category and click on your parcel to see if it coincides with the Conserve Virginia layer. The important thing to note about this is, again, because ag and forestry are combined on this, you need to click on the polygon and then look in that little detail box associated with the polygon to see if it is showing up because it's ag or because it's forestry. So if it's a little hard to see, or at least on my laptop screen, but in that little box, it indicates here that it is yes for agriculture and no for forestry. So you want to make note of that. And as Sue mentioned, you get the full 20 points if 50% or more of the property is within Conserve Virginia, and 10 points if it's 1 to 49%. Next slide. So this is my information. That's basically all I have. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm always available to help, and feel free to ask them today, put them in the chat box, or reach out to me at any point. And that's me.
Thank you so much, Jen.
Yeah.
Now going to, were there questions in the chat, Gina? Okay, no questions. So now I'm gonna bring up Amanda's presentation for forestry. So excuse me for one moment while I try to make that happen.
And while Sue's doing that, I'll just double check that everybody can hear me. Is the sound okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Let's see.
And I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I am Amanda Sheps, and I am with the Department of Forestry. I'm the Forest Land Conservation Specialist that covers the eastern half of the state. In that role, I work with landowners on the development of their new easements, and that does include the recipients of the VLCF grants. I have been working on 2 projects with a lot of assistance from Larry and Sue this past year, and hopefully those will be wrapping up here pretty soon.
Okay.
And I'm also filling in today for Terry Lasher. So Terry Lasher is the Assistant State Forester, and he would ordinarily be giving this presentation to you, but I'm happy that I can join you this afternoon and walk you through a little bit of this. Okay, Sue, I think we can go right ahead to the
Awesome.
first slide. Thank you. Okay, these are the 8 criteria that are looked at for projects that are submitted in the forestry category. And I will give a little brief overview of the meaning of each of these criteria and a little bit of an explanation for why they're important. And then we're going to look at a hypothetical project and see how the scoring would work on this project and the points that are earned in each one. So the first one is property acreage, which probably mostly speaks for itself. We are prioritizing larger properties. One of the main goals of the Department of Forestry's conservation program is the preservation of unfragmented forests. So a larger property will score more highly for that reason. We're also looking for properties with a high percentage forestry cover. We really are looking for about 75% of the acreage being in forestry use, and that the forestry use is definitely the main use of the property overall, although for sure there can be other portions of the property devoted to other use, particularly typical would be agriculture. The third is the percent of forest that is in high forest conservation value. And this was a mapping analysis that I think was originally done about 10 years ago by the Department of Forestry and updated very recently in 2018. And it can be found on the Natural Heritage Database Explorer, as we've seen with some of the other mapping analyses. And that analysis was put together, and it was looking for ranking forested properties breaking it up into 5 categories from highest value to lowest value. And that was looking at forestry that is, or forested properties where the forest is the highest quality, where the property is the most productive, where potentially the forest is the most vulnerable for conversion to another land use. It might also include whether the property contains significant forest communities or a diminished species like the longleaf pine. And again, that can be seen on the Natural Heritage Database Explorer, or for those of you who are GIS users, you can also find that those GIS shapefiles for download on the Department of Forestry website. We're also looking for the length of water courses on a property. A lot of people may not be aware that one of the primary missions of the Department of Forestry is the protection of water quality, and projects that have Department of Forestry easements require that after the easement is recorded, that all the best management practices during timber harvest are what is typically voluntary becomes required during the easement. And so we are interested in knowing in advance the length of water courses that will be impacted by that level of protection. We're also, similar to what Jen described, we are also looking for adjacency to other conserved lands. As I mentioned, we are prioritizing the conservation of large, unfragmented forested blocks. So within a mile or so is going to score the highest if you're within a mile or so of other conserved lands. We're also looking as to what kind of management the forest on a property has. We're looking specifically for a forest stewardship management plan. And for those of you who are not familiar with that document, that is a plan that's developed by the landowner and either a Department of Forestry employee or a private consulting forester to outline the goals of the landowner relative to timber production. Could also be some other aspects like enhancements for wildlife or for improvements for scenic value. But it's a plan that demonstrates that the landowner is interested in and focused on and hopefully working toward maximizing the productivity of the forest on their property. The 7th is a forest land base preservation, which is the amount of forest that the landowner is going to commit to having be perpetually forested. So ideally, this is a number that's 75% or higher of the property that would be dedicated perpetually for forest cover. And finally, the percent within Conserve Virginia, as both Sue and Jen have shown how to find that information. Also on the Natural Heritage Database Explorer, you can look for your property to see where the overlap is with Conserve Virginia. And we're looking for the percentage of the property where that overlap is, that actual number, whether it's 30% or 70%, but how much of that property overlaps with Conserve Virginia. Okay, Sue, if you wouldn't mind, the next slide. Okay, thank you, ma'am. This is an example property, just so we can walk through what this criteria might look like. So on a 500-acre property that is 90% forested in this instance, we might find in a very rosy scenario that 400 acres would qualify as high forest conservation value, but that is actually an unusual occurrence. So it would be, just like I said, it's a very rosy scenario. So if your project is somewhat less than that, don't be discouraged. This particular hypothetical property, it also is overlapped 63% by Conserve Virginia. It has 6,250 feet of water courses within 2 miles of a DWR wildlife management area. It does have a forest stewardship management plan, and crucially, having the plan is important in and of itself, but actually having implemented the recommendations that were developed by the professional forester is also an aspect that's taken into consideration. And this particular applicant is also willing to permanently protect 375 acres of the forest, which is 75%. Okay, Sue, if you would go to the next slide. Thank you, ma'am. Okay, so in this instance, well, the maximum score that you can get just based on acreage alone is 10, and it's a half a point for every 50 acres. So on this 500-acre property, they got half of the possible scores, which means that over 1,000 acres, it's diminishing returns. So anything up to 1,000 acres is going to get 10 points or less, but 1,000 acres or greater, you've maximized the 10 points. Okay, Sue. Thank you. The percent forested is going to have a greater number of points received for this. This is the maximum possible of 20, and it is the actual property, the percentage of the forest on the property multiplied by 20. And so in our hypothetical situation, the forest cover is 90%, which yields 18 points. Okay, Sue. Okay, this is what the forest conservation, high forest conservation value map looks statewide. And again, this can be accessed on the Natural Heritage Database Explorer. We're looking specifically for the portions of the forest on the property that score a 4 or a 5. So very high or outstanding. That qualifies as high forest conservation value. 3, 2, and 1 are excluded from that. So that again is going to be a percentage of the property multiplied out to give you some portion up to 15 points. And on our hypothetical, we're getting 13.4 points. Okay, Sue. Okay, again, this is a very simple calculation. It's you can measure the water courses on your property by looking either at the Natural Heritage Database Explorer or also by local county GIS or any other method, but we are looking for we're prioritizing the properties with the greatest amount of water courses, and you can earn, or your project can earn a maximum of 15 points. And on our hypothetical, 500 acres, 6,250 feet is, maybe a little on the lower side than you would expect for a property that size, depending on where you are in the state, but this property got 6.25 points. Okay. Adjacency, as Jen described for the agricultural lands, this is also very important for the forest lands category. And also, like Jen described, it's not necessary that the adjacent property or the closest conserved land necessarily be a forested property, but just that it either have a conservation easement or be a land in public ownership. And of course, the closer you are, the higher that project scores, and it's a maximum score of 5. And this property is receiving the highest possible score of 5. Okay, so this is the Forest Stewardship Management Plan. If the application in this category, if this project has a current plan and the plan has been implemented, and by that, there will be recommendations about, for instance, when a forested tract may need to be thinned or dealing with invasive species and that kind of thing. And if the landowner has followed through on those recommendations, the project will receive the highest possible score, which is 5. Having a plan that is 10 years old or more recent, so more recent than 10 years old, would qualify as having a plan. If the recommendations have not been implemented, there is still the possibility of earning 3 points. Some of you might be seeing this and you're having a specific project in mind, and you are wondering if it makes sense to go ahead and develop a plan in advance of doing an application. I would say if that's a thought that's on your mind, that you reach out to myself or Terry Lasher to find out about what we might be looking for specifically in that plan in anticipation that a project might go under conservation easement. This particular hypothetical property did have a plan, and the plan's recommendations were implemented, and it did score the highest possible 5 points. Okay, Sue? Okay, so the forest land-based preservation, again, I mentioned that we are looking for landowners to commit to a minimum of 75% of the forest cover to be preserved in perpetuity. If you do the math here, you'll find that this hypothetical situation, this landowner had committed to exactly 75%. And actually, I'm not sure why it's got 8.3 points, but he got some fraction less than the, oh, I see what's happened here. I'm seeing this presentation along with you for the first time today. So that math broke out that he got something less than the 10 points, but it was 8.3 points, so very high. Okay, Sue, thank you. The Conserve Virginia layer, which Sue has just described and Jen has also described, that would be very similar to what Jen described on the agricultural applications. If you click on the Conserve Virginia layer and you select the agricultural and forestry category, you can see how the potential project overlaps with that layer, and then it's going to yield a percentage of the property that is overlapped there. And as you can see, it's anything greater than 50% of the property overlapped by Conserve Virginia will yield the highest possible score, which is 20 points. Less than 50%, you get half of the points, and unfortunately, if there is no overlap with Conserve Virginia, no points are awarded. So this particular property was got the highest possible, which was 20 points, because it exceeded the 50% threshold. Okay, Sue, thank you. All right, so this is just a breakdown so that you can see how this particular hypothetical application would have looked based on the 100 point scoring scale. It scored extremely highly, nearly 81 points. That would be a pretty competitive project. So this would give you a sense of how your potential application might look relative to this one if you submit it in the forestry category. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the takeaway is, as Jen described, the grant amount that is set aside for the agricultural and forestry categories are split between the two. And I think that means that the applications in these two categories tend to be very competitive. And so it's very helpful in advance for those of you considering applying in these categories to go ahead and go through this scoring process yourselves to see how you fare. You know, that'll give you an indication of how this might proceed. And it's definitely in everybody's best interest that you make sure that the aspects of the application that the forestry department or that the committee will be considering in this category is fully and accurately documented. So the stream length, the acres, all of that fully and accurately documented to the best of your ability. And because this category does tend to be very competitive. It's probably in the interest of looking to see whether or not you can add additional scores by being considered as having aspects that are part of a secondary category. So I would encourage everyone to make sure, if that's possible on your application, to look at that very closely. Make sure not to miss out on those possibilities. Okay, Sue? Okay, and finally, this is the contact information for Terry Lasher. As I described, he would ordinarily be giving this presentation to you. If you have questions, particularly questions related to specific applications, I would recommend that you reach out to Terry for some guidance if that is, of interest to you, and he may send you my way. But in any event, I'm glad that I could go over this with you, and if you have questions now, I think I did see some across, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yes, we do have some questions. Andy asked if all projects have to be open for public access.
That's probably a Sue question. Are you specifically for the Department of Forestry category? No, they do not. Although Sue can probably, or Larry could probably speak to how that aspect of an application is a benefit.
No, all projects do not have to be open for public access, but you get points if you are.
All right. Jim asked if a forested property would qualify for this category if it's not intended to be harvested and is intended to be kept as wild forest.
That is actually a fantastic question, Jim, and I probably won't be able to give you a complete
Amanda,
answer.
are you okay to answer that?
I'll do my best, but maybe Sue and Larry can provide some answers based on some precedents. But generally speaking, the Department of Forestry is mostly interested in what we call working forests. So we're looking for landowners who are utilizing their land, and it's a productive forest. So, and that's an aspect too of the Forest Stewardship Management Plan and its implementation, that there be a working forest that is preserving the timber base in Virginia. That is part of our conservation mission. And so a project where it is an entirely, where the forest is entirely going to be a no-cut scenario is probably not an ideal project in the forestry category, but it may be an excellent project in a different category.
Todd was wondering about the forest conservation value map, noting that there are white spaces on the map, and was wondering if that means that those spaces are not rated.
That's right. That is right. So if it is, the white spaces are, sometimes they're roads, sometimes they're actually already conserved properties because that was taken out of the analysis. But so you can just kind of gloss over that. If you are looking at the forest conservation value mapping, definitely focus on the dark green and the medium green, and that's the areas that you will be focused on and calculating what the percentage of the property is that has that cover.
All right, this might be a more broad question that goes across categories, but Jim was wondering if water course is defined somewhere.
It is. I don't know if it's defined, maybe defined actually even in the VLCF grant manual, but it's for sure defined in the best management practices manual. But any channel that has evidence of water movement at any point of the year does not have to be a perennial stream, does not have to have water in it at that moment, but it will have signs that water has moved through it at some point over the year, is a water course. And sometimes that is the kind of thing that needs to be sort of determined in the field. But for lay people, if there's evidence that water is moving through that channel, it is a water course.
All right, we have two more broad questions. Peter was wondering how much funding had been allocated for each category this round.
We had covered that at the beginning. Sorry, Peter. We have a total of, was it 3.3 or 3,375,000 that's divided equally among the 4 categories, which leaves 843,000, something like that in each category. Is that right, Larry? I see you nodding your head. Okay. But we did, Larry and I, when we were going back through last year's grant round, we noticed that, Wendy, you'll remember there was 30,000 or so left over in the historic category, which we will ask the board to roll into this grant round for the historic category. Just as a side note.
All right, and then the final questions that we have right now is Andy was wondering what score is considered competitive, and if that varies by category, then what does that look like for each category?
That does vary by category and by application. So it's really, we can't say until we see them all together, unfortunately. You know, we could send you some information from prior grant rounds if you email us to give you an idea. But it's, you know, the grant manual changes, projects change, scoring changes. So it's really hard to say. That's it. Wendy, thank you so much. You've taken the screen. That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
Sure. Thank you. And Wendy Musumeci is joining us from Department of Historic Resources.
Good afternoon. I'm Wendy Musumeci. I am the Easement Program Coordinator at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and a longtime member of the VLCF Interagency Task Force. I'm going to provide an overview of the historic area preservation category for you today. For those of you who have a copy of the grant manual or are interested in following along, the historic area category information is on pages 7 to 9 of the grant manual, and then the scoring sheet itself is on page 19 of the grant manual. And I'm going to start by going through, a breakdown of the scoring criteria for this category, and then a quick review of some of the requirements of the category. This criterion number 1 in our category is historic significance, and the maximum number of points is 35. This section establishes the type of historic or cultural resource to be protected. And there are a wide variety of resource types that could be applicable here. These include architecturally significant buildings and structures, archaeological sites, historic landscapes, sites of cultural importance, or Civil War, Revolutionary War, or War of 1812, battlefields or sites. And that's just a sampling. There are a lot of other types that we haven't included here. To summarize this first criterion, what we are looking for, or a strong proposal, is one that is likely to protect or preserve a resource that is listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register, and that is the state level register of historic buildings, structures, and sites. It's likely to protect or preserve a resource that is a Civil War, a Virginia Civil War, American Revolutionary War, or War of 1812 battlefield or site, is formally determined eligible for listing on the Virginia Landmarks Register by the Department of Historic Resources, retains a high degree of historic integrity, and is included in the Conserve Virginia Cultural and Historic Preservation category layer. To delve just a little bit deeper into what some of these criterion mean, historic significance is 25 points are awarded for properties or resources that are individually listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register. These can include properties such as residential, archaeological, institutional, agricultural, or industrial. If a property is individually listed, there will be an associated nomination form that is maintained by our agency and within the grant manual, and I will talk a little bit later in the presentation. If you're not sure about the status of a given property, whether or not it's listed or found eligible, you can contact our archives department, and contact information for that is in the grant manual as well. A resource or property can also be designated as a contributing resource to a district that's listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register. And while we often associate historic districts with towns or cities, there are also a number of rural historic districts throughout Virginia. And in these types of districts, both land and buildings can be considered contributing resources. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're evaluating your project. In addition to resources that are listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register, eligible properties also include Virginia Civil War, Revolutionary War, or War of 1812 battlefields or sites. Because battlefields are often not listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register, there is a different evaluation metric for these. If the battlefield is not listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register, it must be identified with a priority rating in one of the following reports administered by the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program. The first is the Report on the Nation's Civil War Battlefields, and that was published in 1993 and has been amended. And then the report, excuse me, to Congress on the historic preservation of Revolutionary War and War of 1812 sites in the United States. These reports identify battlefield sites needing preservation, and they assign them a priority ranking. And the example in the box here on this slide just gives you an overview of what's in the report on the nation's Civil War battlefields. And the priorities, the highest priorities are those battlefields that have a critical need for action, meaning their preservation is critical and urgent. And then that sort of goes down the scale to battlefields that have the potential for comprehensive preservation, those that need additional protection, as well as fragmented sites. There are also some other criteria in the historic significance section that may be applicable to your project. Certain properties have been formally determined eligible for listing on the Virginia Landmarks Register by the Department of Historic Resource, but for whatever reason, the listing process was not completed. So there are 10 possible points awarded in this category for properties that may not be listed but have been determined eligible. And that eligibility determination is made through the Department of Historic Resources process for evaluation and listing on the Historic Register. Please keep in mind that official listing on the register will be required for properties awarded funding under this section. Lastly, the other scoring criteria under number 1, historic significance, also incorporates resources on the property that or the property itself that does not meet the criteria above. These resources are not listed or found eligible, but are still potentially historically significant. Historic cemeteries is a good example of a resource type that often falls under this category. And here is some contact information I mentioned earlier for the Department of Historic Resources Archives. And they can assist you in determining whether or not a property is listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register or has been determined eligible. And the other possibility for points under this section is for resources with a high degree of historic integrity. And we look at integrity as the ability of a property to convey its historic significance through attributes such as location, setting, design, feeling, and association. The second criterion that we look at in this category is threat. The maximum score is 15 points. The highest level of threats are those properties that have been on the market for sale within the last calendar year, are in an estate currently being settled, are threatened by development where plats or plans have been approved by the locality within the last calendar year, or properties that are in imminent danger of demolition. 10 points may be awarded for those properties that are recently on the market for sale, meaning more than one calendar year, properties that are vacant or unoccupied or significantly deteriorated and in need of immediate preservation. 5 points are awarded to properties that are adjacent to a similar property that's currently on the market for sale or has been sold within the previous calendar year. Importantly, we ask that applicants submit documentation supporting the specific threat. For example, if the property has been listed on the market, include the MLS listing showing that that property is indeed for sale. If there have been plans for development of the property, include plats, any recorded plats of subdivision or other documentation from the locality that indicates that that property has been planned for development. Criterion number 3 evaluates the extent to which plans for future uses of the property, such as for historic site interpretation or as a battlefield park, are consistent with historic resource stewardship and protection. The maximum score under this criterion is 10 points, and the two metrics for evaluation are what are the applicant's plans for the future uses of the property, and what are the applicant's plans for treatment, alteration, and maintenance of the historic resources on the property. So the two, you could potentially get 10 points if the application identifies future uses and how those are consistent with historic resource stewardship and protection, and also potentially 5 points for how are you going to treat those resources on the property, and are your treatment plans or your plans for maintenance, are those also appropriate and consistent with historic resource stewardship and protection. It's important to note that this section emphasizes, as I mentioned, future uses as well as treatment of historic resources. So if you have if you have a property that has had any historic structures reports or cultural lands assessments or maintenance plans, please provide those with your application. It doesn't necessarily need to be the entire plan. If there are relevant sections of a maintenance plan or a historic structures report that applies to something specific related to your project, we ask that you submit that with your application. And importantly, all proposals or project plans must be consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. Criterion number 4 is historic resource protection with a maximum score of 10 points. This criterion evaluates the degree to which the applicant is willing to preserve all historic resources on a property in accordance with DHR's standard easement template. 10 points are awarded if the proposed easement terms and restrictions provide comprehensive protection for historic resources and are specifically consistent with DHR's easement template. This can be shown through either attaching a draft deed of easement or a deed term sheet that specifically details the provisions of the easement that are proposed. Criterion number 5, adjacency to conserved lands. The maximum score in this criterion is 5 points, and this evaluates the degree to which a property is located adjacent to or near already conserved lands held in perpetuity. The first map here, or the map on the top, shows a target property that is directly adjacent to conserved lands and would fall within the 5-point range. The map on the bottom shows a target property that is in viewshed of or close physical proximity to an existing conserved land. And similar to what some of the other category representatives have said, the adjacent lands that are conserved don't necessarily have to be for historic purposes or preserving historic sites. It's just primarily that the land is conserved. There's also an opportunity to earn 1 point for those properties that may not be adjacent to conserved lands or in direct proximity, but they still represent a unique cultural resource within a geographical area. Criterion number 6 furthers public interests. Maximum score is 5 points. This criteria evaluates the extent to which the project includes specific plans for programs that will further public interests. What we're looking for here is for the applicant to identify when the access will occur and back that up with documentation on how these programs will benefit the public. So 5 points may be awarded for projects that include specific plans for programs that promote research, education, community outreach, or heritage tourism. Applications that conserve resources associated with underrepresented communities are encouraged, particularly those that also provide public educational opportunities. Projects that include general plans for programs to be developed that would promote research, education, community outreach, or heritage tourism may receive 3 points. No points will be awarded if the project does not contain specific plans that would further public interests. The last criterion in this category is similar to the other categories, the Conserve Virginia criterion. The maximum score here is 20 points. The project will be evaluated based on the percentage of the total project area that is included in the Conserve Virginia Cultural and Historic Preservation category. 50 to 100, if 50 to 100% of the project is included in the Cultural and Historic Preservation category, the project will be awarded 20 points. And an example of that from the Virginia Natural Heritage Database, the Conserve Virginia layer, is the map on the right that shows a target property that is fully within the Cultural and Historic Preservation category. If 1 to 49% of the project is within the Cultural and Historic Preservation category, the project will receive 10 points. Moving away from the scoring criteria, I just want to briefly discuss some of the additional requirements that may be unique to this category. The applicants must submit high quality photographs or digital images for if you are applying in the historic area preservation category. If your project includes built historic resources, please include photos that show the exterior of the primary resources on the property, as well as any secondary buildings and structures, architecturally significant interior spaces, and the setting and view shed of that primary historic resource. For archaeological sites, a general view or site plan and images documenting the condition of the site should be submitted. For battlefields and other landscapes, images should document the overall site, its setting and surroundings, view shed, as well as all historic and non-historic structures, roads, and other features within the battlefield or site. If funds are awarded under this category for the purpose of acquiring fee simple title to or an easement on eligible historic properties, the property owner shall offer to convey to the Virginia Board of Historic Resources a perpetual historic preservation easement on the property to be acquired with the grant funds. As a point of clarification, the Board of Historic Resources holds our easements, and those easements are administered by staff at the Department of Historic Resources. So that can get a little confusing, but basically the board holds the easements and we as staff administer those easements. Once the offer is presented to the board, they will decide whether to accept the easement based on established criteria and policies governing DHR's easement program. The property must meet the eligibility requirements, or DHR may recommend an alternative holder. And those eligibility requirements are primarily what I went through at the beginning of this presentation, that the property needs to be listed either individually or as a contributing resource, or the property needs to be a battlefield site that has a priority ranking in one of those specific reports that I outlined. If the property is not listed at the time of application, it may be required to be listed, and failure to list will disqualify the project and the funds will not be distributed. And this gets to one of our participants' questions. In this category, the easement itself will require that the property be open for public access a minimum of 2 days per calendar year. This is a requirement of and a policy of DHR's easement program, but it is also a specific requirement of the historic area preservation category for this grant program as well. Lastly, I would encourage new applicants or even returning applicants to contact us to obtain information about DHR's easement program, including our easement application form and requirements, as well as copies of our template easement, so that the applicants can be sure they understand the program requirements for the easement program prior to applying for the VLCF grant. I can be reached at the contact information here on the screen. My name is Wendy Musamechi. Right now, we're still working remotely, so email is probably the best way to reach out, at least initially. And my colleague Megan Melanat, if you're unable to reach me for any reason, please feel free to contact Megan. And I have also included on this slide some additional web resources for our department, but also if you would like to see if a property is listed, we do keep those nomination forms online, and you can look those up through our agency website. And then I've also included links for the battlefield priority rating reports, and those are through the National Park Service website. That's all I have today. I'm able to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wendy. We do have a couple questions that Gina will ask you.
Okay.
Todd wanted to check to be sure that this grant won't fund feasibility studies for historic properties. Is that correct?
No, the grant would be for acquisition of the property or for acquisition of an easement on the property.
The question was about feasibility studies for historic properties.
Right, so that's not covered. The grant is for acquiring property or acquisition of easements, not for feasibility studies.
Okay, great. And then we had another question, which I'm not sure if it was specific to this category or across categories. Maureen was saying, it seems that a 30-acre site is too small to be competitive. Is that correct?
I can answer for this category, and I don't know if Sue wants to answer more broadly for the other categories. In our category, a 50-acre site could be competitive, an urban lot could be competitive, so there's no acreage limitation or sort of minimum threshold that would need to be met. So to be competitive in this category, it really depends on the historic significance of the property and not as much on the acreage.
Right, and it also depends on the location of the property. It could be a 50-acre addition to a state forest or a state park or a natural area, which could be significant. So it really depends on the conservation purpose of the property.
Was that it, Gina, I guess, for questions for this category?
Yes, that was it for the questions. So I will now switch over to Rob Evans. So I figure out how to take the screen again. Let's see. Oops, screen share. Yeah. Slideshow from beginning. Okay, so Rob Evans is with us today. And this is where you have to see that little circle down there. That's how you advance.
Can I advance with this?
I don't know, you can try.
Thank you all for having us. Can everyone see the slides and hear me? We'll just try to advance. I work with the Division of Natural Heritage at the Department of Conservation. So if you have any questions about the natural area category, I'm one of the people who can answer those for you. So we'll just move into it and give a little bit of background about who we are as a program. And we do everything based on a scientific method and a systematic approach to identifying and protecting the most important biological diversity areas in the Commonwealth. And if this slide will advance, we can go, but it's locked up or something. And now it's probably going to jump a bunch. Let's see. Sure. There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we're part of the Nature Serve Network, which is now a global network. And there are programs like the Virginia Heritage Program across all states and several countries that use the same sort of methods. And we've been in operation for over 30 years collecting data across the Commonwealth. So what we try to do is conserve Virginia's biodiversity through inventory protection and stewardship. And this gives you a little sense of all the things that we do. We have a series of biological experts that are specialists in everything from cave and karst to botany and ecology, who found 30 species new to science and at least 300 new to Virginia. We develop all kinds of data tools that you've been hearing about, Natural Heritage Data Explorer, and I'll show you more about that, but that's a database tool that we provide. Of course, we do land protection, and we have a committed and dedicated stewardship staff that manage land across the Commonwealth. A background on our methodology that's common both to our program and those across the country. Everything that exists as an entity of biodiversity we call an element. And if you look at the bottom left of the screen, you can see that we call natural communities, plant species, animal species, all of those individually could be called elements. And those numbers give you an idea of the different number of species that we keep track of in our databases. Each of those gets assigned a rank globally and in the state that tells us how rare it is, and that's based not just on what it is doing here, but across the world if it's found there. And then every time one of those elements is found in the state, we map it. And you can sort of see that we have over 9,000 known locations in our database. And then each known occurrence is ranked with a standard set of criteria. And then sites are delineated around every known mapped occurrence. And we have over 2,700 sites, and you can view those in the Natural Heritage Data Explorer if you choose to. And then every individual site gets a rank. And there's different kinds of rankings, but one of the most important for this purpose for our scoring is whether it's an essential conservation site or not. And there's 472 of those in the Commonwealth. I mentioned the data models and geographic data. Here's just an example of some of the things you could look at if you chose to go to the Heritage Data Explorer. And everyone thus far has talked about their category, getting various pieces of it. You can find the answers to that in the Data Explorer tool. And so there's a look at it, and the Conserve Virginia model that the governor announced a couple years ago. This is the primary place where you can view what is found in Conserve Virginia. There's a little snapshot of various people have shown it and talked about it, but if you log into NHDE, there are just a series of check boxes on the left, so you can view essentially any resource you'd like to view, including all those that are part of various people's criteria for the funding in this project. Background again, the Heritage Program was started in 1989, and the legislature assigned the goal of preserving the natural diversity of the biological resources of the Commonwealth. And we now know, based on our inventory, there are at least 35,000 different species found in the Commonwealth, and that includes everything from birds to plants to butterflies and on and on. And the legislature didn't distinguish the importance of one of these more than the other. So to accomplish the legislative mandate, we need to conserve all of those equally. It also said that it created the Heritage Program, and it gave us some of our roles, and I highlighted the fact that one of the things we are supposed to do is establish natural area preserves. That's part of the code, and that's what we'll be talking about today, is what it takes to become a natural area preserve. But in general, preserves represent a statewide system of lands. These could be anywhere in the Commonwealth. They have a primary purpose to protect and conserve natural heritage resources. So if you remember those things that I mentioned, the elements at the beginning, the rare plants, animals, natural communities, the preserve has to have one or more of those things to be eligible. All of these are voluntary. We don't make anybody establish a preserve unless you get funding in this category. We don't condemn anybody's land. They either voluntarily dedicate it, donate it, or voluntarily sell it. And to become part of the system and part of this grant program, anything that's funded under this category is dedicated in perpetuity, and the deed has permanent language on there that relates to the preservation of the natural heritage resources that are present. Just two little examples of the kinds of things that are represented on the natural area preserves, different parts of the state. Collectively, they represent a really interesting museum, almost snapshot of the different diversity that's found here in the Commonwealth. There's a little map. So currently we have 65 natural area preserves, and that map gives you a little bit of an idea of the distribution of those. And around the edges of that, I'm giving you examples of I call it the focal species. Each preserve is designed with one or more heritage resources in mind. one of usually the rarest things that we still have thriving somewhere in the Commonwealth, whether it's freshwater mussels in the Clinch River or Powell River or maritime forests along the coast. I'm circling there, preserve number 64 was established earlier in the year, and 65, both closed early in the year with special funding from another source that we won't really talk about here. And I circle 2 that are pending preserves that were funded with VLCF at the last cycle with grants to 2 other partners who are dedicating those lands as natural area preserves. And the concept of essential conservation sites weighs heavily in your applications if you go for this category. Here's a definition of those. These are the most important areas of the landscape, basically, where critical action is needed to ensure the long-term viability of one or more heritage resources that are the best known examples we have in Virginia. Just a general portrayal of that. The green blobs on this are places where we know. These are the sites that we've delineated around known examples of a heritage resource. These are the best, and this is the protection status of those. So between the efforts of all the conservation partners, a lot of the sites have been at least partially protected and some fully protected. So overall, really less than 20% of the most important sites left that we know about in the state are fully private and not protected at all. So again, the preserve system that you would be adding to if you got a grant through this, the location needs to be informed by the presence of the species that are there. Our goal is that those would be efficient and comprehensive, meaning we're trying to conserve the heritage resources on the least amount of land possible and make sure that everything is included. And in the end, most sites don't qualify. So a lot of people like to think if you just set aside an area and you don't do anything in it, that's a natural area, but that does not just qualify to become a natural area preserve. So what does it take to get through the VLCF scoring round to become part of this? We'll talk about that. You can see a little bit there that VLCF has funded at least 43 tracts that have been added to the preserve system since 2000. So VLCF funding is one of the most important ways that preserves get created in the state. As other people have talked about, the points that you need to get or you'll be scored against all the other applications that get submitted this time. There are biodiversity significance, which is the #1 scoring category, the ecological integrity, the management needs, likelihood of success and threats, and how you relate to conserve Virginia. And we'll go through each of those individually. And I'll just remind you that on each of these categories, like almost everyone else's, one way to get at the tool or the layers to answer these questions is through the Heritage Data Explorer. So the conservation site significance can bring you 20 points, the parcel significance another 10, and then the global significance and the site rank another 5. And at the bottom, we just show 2 dramatically different examples. And I guess it's pretty obvious which one might have the most conservation significance there and the type that we'd like to protect. And a theoretical example here for the conservation site significance, if you go into the Heritage Data Explorer, you can place a polygon on top of the map. And if you are located within a so-called essential conservation site, you would get 20 points. I've drawn an arrow to point to an orange one there that is an essential site. And all the green ones on the map are conservation sites, but they're not considered essential. So you could have a project inside one of the green ones. And if you do that, you would get 10 points. And in our case, someone asked about white space, and I think it was forestry maybe. White space on the map on the conservation sites is nothing. There's no heritage resource significance known there, so you would get 0 points for that. The parcel significance, when you place, and I've drawn 3 boxes that represent theoretical parcels that you could have and how they may or may not relate to a site. So in this instance, the blue polygon is a conservation site that you would see the boundaries of in NHDE. And inside that, those different colors, there's sort of a brown, pinkish, and maybe some other color in there. There's 3 or 4 different colors. All of those represent known heritage elements inside the site. So in the case of Tract A, you can see that it touches the site barely, but it doesn't touch any of the heritage occurrences, so it gets many fewer points than if it was Tract C, which you could tell touches at least 2 different types of natural heritage resources, versus Tract B, which touches only 1. So you'd be scored according to those types of factors. And then similarly, each of those same types of sites have a biodiversity score that's been assigned to each of them in a standard way. So this just gives you, again, an example. I've pasted the ranking over top of it. So that big site in the middle that has lots of different heritage elements in it is B1, which is globally significant, meaning whatever's in there is important, not just in Virginia, but it's important for conserving that element in the world because it's one of a handful, usually 5 or less, known places in the world where that thing occurs. So the ecological integrity, landscape, parcel, and connectivity, and just a general picture at the bottom, you can see on the left, that looks like a landscape that from this aerial view looks relatively more intact than the parcel on the right, where most of the forest in this case has been cleared. So you'll get different points accordingly. And again, we have a standardized way to assess that, not subjectively. So again, in the middle is the same conservation site we've been looking at in the last couple examples. And we've drawn in the ecological cores, another layer in NHDE, and you can see those kind of all around the perimeter and on the inside. And if you open NHDE, or in our case here, the red polygons are the largest, most significant intact landscapes in the state. So they get a C1, so you get more points if you're in one of those, a few less if you're in a C2, and on down the scale. And then for the parcel, I'm sorry, I can't see some of my material here because this little icon is somewhat in the way. Let me move it over there, maybe. I drew a theoretical box around a parcel that someone could be submitting, and we have a factor there about the natural land cover. And based on, in most cases, the cover of a cleared field is not considered a natural land cover, at least to us. So if the majority of your land cover was in that, you wouldn't get very many points, but if you're in a forested landscape and the bulk of your tract was in that, you would get more points. Connectivity, same shape we've been looking at, and you can open a tab on NHDE that shows the existing managed areas is what they're called in the database. So these are places that all of our partners and state agencies have already acquired or put easements on. And all of those should be in the database. We update that as regularly as someone protects a piece of ground with an easement or ownership. And so all of those are in the database. So you'd be able to see where they are relative to your project. And then each has been assigned a biodiversity management intent, 1 through 5, 1 being the highest, meaning that whoever has that piece of land has a deed stated intent to preserve and maintain the biodiversity values on the property, all the way down to a 4 or a 5, which means it's a, quote, protected space, but it's not protected in any form or fashion for anything related to biodiversity. The management needs and likelihood, other people in forestry and perhaps agriculture have talked a little bit about this. We don't demand a management plan out of the gate, but we do ask that you discuss what the natural resources on your property need and what is your capacity to take care of those. And in the case here, I'm showing a theoretical example where prescribed fire might be necessary to maintain the heritage resource. So if that were the case, you should acknowledge that and make us understand that you understand that and how you intend to get it done. And then you also get points if you have given the time to have a site visit scheduled with heritage staff and where we're in direct contact with the owner, not an owner's agent. And if you fully describe the threats to that property and the heritage resources specifically. And again, back to the management needs. If a parcel that you're proposing ends up needing minimal management to conserve the important features of that site, you would get a 10-point scale there. If it's on the other end, if it's absolutely unmanageable for some reason, that something is so threatening to that tract of land that there's literally nothing you can do to stop that threat, then you would, of course, get 0 points. Management capacity, I think we all understand what that is. Do you as an applicant have the proven expertise and capacity to address what those management needs are? And we'll look at that in your application. We don't want to infer whether you're an expert manager. You need to tell us that you are and substantiate that. And it shows a little bit of an example there about how you would do that. So more information is better. I already mentioned the site visit and landowner contact. You'll be scored more highly if you bring it to our attention. And if it's desirable, if we don't already know what's there, if it looks like it could harbor heritage resources, then we will try to send somebody out there. And if you give us enough time to do that, we will give you more points for it. Threats. Instead of just saying a property is threatened, we have, again, an automated way to do that, and that's called development vulnerability in the Heritage Data Explorer. That's the layer that you would pick up, and I highlighted it on here. In this case, the brighter the color, the more threatened from development it is. In this case, there's no bright orange, which would be the highest category. So you can use this to write down the percentage of your tract that's in various categories that will point to the objective risk. And like everyone else has talked about, Conserve Virginia, which again, you can get all those layers in the NHDE. And if, in this case, if at least 50% of your project tract is included in the category called natural habitat and biological diversity, you'll get 20 points, and 10 if it's less than that. So again, I'll just draw your attention to NHD. I'm sure by this point everyone knows what it is and kind of how to find it. And I'm not a special trainer on that. If you need help learning how to use it, we can help you. For example, I just drew 2 different screens here that show, if you can see in the middle, there's a draw, a making a map and drawing feature. And I used that earlier just to draw a fictitious polygon right in the center of the screen, just east there of Farmville. And I drew it on 2 different screens and opened up different layers. So what I'm showing on the top is the thing that I called the managed conservation lands. We talked about those earlier. So you can see here, anything that's either green or red, somebody has a protection status on those pieces of land. So that's an easy way to tell how far you are from those, or maybe you overlap them. And then the same, I just opened a different polygon here, or a different category, to see what Conserve Virginia was saying about this polygon. And you can see that I randomly drew that, and underneath that there are some green areas that show that Conserve Virginia overlaps that, at least in some areas. So you can pretty easily do this in your office or at home. And just a final reminder that if you get funding from the natural area category, the code dictates that all property which is funded, including this matching grant program, must be dedicated as a natural area preserve. That means permanent deed restrictions that are set to ensure that the heritage resources are protected in perpetuity. And when we cobble all these together that you'll do with us and that we've already done, we will sort of weave together this tapestry that is Virginia's precious natural heritage. And it would sort of look like that from the southwest part of the state to the coast. And so if anyone has any questions, you can contact me there. I've put my name at the bottom. And you can also contact Irvin Wilson in our program if you have any questions. And I can do some now if there are any. And other than that, I appreciate your time.
There were not any questions that came up in the chat box.
That's good.
So you must have covered everything well.
All right.
If you want to, let's see. I have to stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Well, Sue, this is Crystal. I can do a quick introduction if you'd like.
Is there any chance you can show me the access code on your screen? I didn't bring it over here with me. I can redial the number, but that access code to get in, I probably can't get. Meaning I would turn on my phone as I walked home to make sure in case something comes up. You know, it's like in the calendar invitation or whatever.
Screen share.
Can you see it?
Okay.
What's the number? I can't see it. 620.
Let's see. Slideshow from beginning.
Thank you.
So
Okay.
next we're going into the
Next.
open space and park category.
Kelby from DCR is going to join us and give just a little bit of information about our open space and parks category. She's going to tell us about the Virginia Outdoors Plan and the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Crystal, are you there?
Thank you, Sue. Yes, can you hear me?
Thanks, Rob. Thanks.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I'm sorry. Once again, I had turned off the sound of my computer so it didn't echo.
No problem. Thank you for that introduction. So yes, I'm Crystal McKelvey, Recreation Grants Manager under the Planning and Recreation Resources Division at DCR. So I'm the main administrator of both the Land and Water Conservation Fund and the Recreational Trails Program. And you can go ahead to the next slide. One thing that we do among many within the Planning and Recreation Resources Division is work on the Virginia Outdoors Plan revisions. So the Virginia Outdoors Plan is the state's comprehensive plan for land conservation, outdoor recreation, and open space planning. This document helps all levels of government and the private sector meet needs pertaining to those matters. This plan is required for Virginia so that we can participate in the federal Land and Water Conservation Fund program. And as you can see, it also provides guidance for the protection of lands through VLCF. Our most recent VOP is from 2018, and we do revise these every 5 years, dating all the way back to 1966 when the Land and Water Conservation Fund began here. The 2018 plan can be found digitally, and it also features an interactive map. And we're already underway with beginning the process for the 2023 update. So you may see more about that over the next couple of years. You can advance. One of the main components of the Virginia Outdoors Plan that is very useful is what we call the Virginia Outdoors Demand Survey. So this was a university-run survey that provides a measure of the attitudes about outdoor recreation resources, as well as the participation in and the demand for a variety of recreational activities. So if you go to the VOP, there's many resources and you can see a lot of information about this survey. But of note, this provides an overview of what the Commonwealth citizens prefer and are looking for in outdoor recreation. So natural areas to visit, parks, trails, and access to waterways over many years have remained among the top recreational needs in the Commonwealth. There's also an increased demand for freshwater fishing and paddle sports, again, linking to that water access. And there's also a large interest in visiting natural areas and preserves. So there's also strong support for public funding, and there's of note an importance of scenic resources while people are planning for their travel and vacations. So you will be needing to access the VOP for completing your application. And I just want you to note that there's many chapters about the different recreation opportunities. And then there's also a breakdown between the PDCs. There's 23 different regional recommendations. So if you're looking for citations for completing your application, please feel free to browse both the overview chapters and the PDC regional chapters. And then I just want to take a moment to discuss the Land and Water Conservation Fund. If you have not heard, we are also in a live grant round now for this program for acquisition projects. This is open until December 15th, and there is $8 million available in LWCF funding. A little background, this is funding available from the National Park Service, administered by DCR,
Eligible applicants are counties, cities, towns, park and recreation authorities, tribal governments, and state agencies. This is a 50-50 match reimbursement grant program. So that means that the costs of the acquisition must be incurred upfront, and then after all due documentation and whatnot, then it is a 50% match of that property. So right now we don't have a max on the request for applications, but there is a $250,000 minimum of LWCF funding request. The properties must be for public outdoor recreation in perpetuity upon acquiring. This is a requirement of LWCF that is the purpose of this fund. NEPA reviews, appraisals are required, and then you can find more information on the PRR LWCF website, all of our application materials. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me through this email address listed here. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm gonna throw it back to the VLCF team to talk more about the scoring criteria for this category. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Crystal. Okay, so our final category of VLCF grants is the open space and parks category. Here, points are awarded on 8 or 9 different criteria that we're just going to go through briefly here. You get points if your project provides access to state waters that offer recreational potential, such as swimming, fishing, and boating. Points are awarded if the project creates a new outdoor recreational opportunity for underserved communities or expands existing parks, protected conservation areas. So this one is a little bit different from the way it's been scored in the past. Here we wanted to put an emphasis on new outdoor recreational opportunities. With COVID over the past many months, we've all been trying to get outside, and the need for more recreation has become has become very obvious. So we're trying to expand where VLCF money can go, and are awarding more points for new outdoor opportunities. Points are awarded also in this category for projects that protect scenic view sheds. We list in these bullet points here a bunch of the different examples of official scenic trails and rivers and roadways. So that's all laid out in our scoring criteria. Also, points are awarded for projects that are supported in local comprehensive plans or regional plans, as well as the statewide Virginia Outdoors Plan. And in both of these cases, please don't send us the entire plan, but please do include a page number and reference or a link to the reports would be great, or a copy of the page where it's mentioned. Also, points are awarded for public use that allows for hunting, fishing, or wildlife watching. If the project provides an outdoor recreational resource to an underserved community, points will be awarded. And here, again, we go back to the VIMS model, but other models can be used to show us that the project will serve an underserved community. And finally, just like all the other categories, Conserve Virginia is looked at. And with open space and parks, there isn't a layer of Conserve Virginia that fits nicely with open space and parks. So we split it up to look at the recreation access model And so 10 points are awarded in that criterion for a demonstrated recreational need for terrestrial and aquatic layers in that model, as well as Conserve Virginia. Points could be awarded 10 points if it's in Conserve Virginia and is open to the public on a daily basis. And that is all that we have for you for this presentation, but we are open to questions. Thanks. So
Are there questions?
There was just one question from Todd about whether NEPA reviews were required as part of the LWCF application. And Crystal already responded to that in the chat
to say
yes,
NEPA
NEPA
reviews need to be completed prior to the project being sent to the National Park Service for authorization. So
awesome.
that's the only question we got.
okay, are there any other questions?
There's one just popped up. What is typically the most competitive category?
What do you think, Larry? Do you think it's open space and parks?
That's what I would say, yes.
Yeah, I mean, they're each competitive in their own way, but I think we have the most applications in open space and parks. The most unfunded ones in open space and parks.
And this is Crystal again. I'll just also say that LWCF, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, is federal funding and VLCF is state funding. So therefore, they can be used in combination on the same project. So sometimes we do see the same projects there. And if you have any questions about how that funding and match can work out, both the VLCF team and myself can be available for any questions about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. That's a great point. That yes, VLCF can be used as match for all sorts of other funding sources. Well, thank you all very much. Unless there's any other questions, to all of our presenters and for all of you for joining us. Please contact any of us if you have questions. Larry and I are happy to go over your applications with you in advance. We can't do it the day they're due or on Thanksgiving, but we'd be happy to work with you anytime before that. Thank you. Oh, is there another question in the chat? I see there's 8. Okay, great. Thank you all very much.